All right, guys. Special treat for you today for our course on storytelling here at Relativity School in LA Center Studios. We have Dr. John Colarusso, who is a visiting scholar from McMaster's in Canada. He has a PhD in linguistics from Harvard, a master's and a PhD in philosophy from Northwestern and Cornell, respectively. He's the author of 7 books, 100 articles, and one of my absolute favorite books in the world, this one right here, Nart Tales, Tales of the Narts, and also sagas, Nart sagas. And these are different stories of a certain set of heroes that he can tell you a little bit about from the Caucasus Mountains. So what we've been doing, John's come down. It's been a long weekend. So we spent Friday up in Berkeley. We recorded him giving an initial address to a night of oral storytelling, where basically we had professional storytellers who recite these stories and some other stories of his. And that was up at a place called the Silk Road House. And then after that, we drove down on our mobile media machine, a massive city bus, drove down to Santa Barbara, and we recorded an interview at the Santa Barbara News Press radio station. And then we went on to have dinner with some leaders in the Mythology program at Pacifica. And then we've recorded almost the entirety of a podcast. But I asked him to hold off on the very first episode on the lens of mythology, mythic lenses, so that he could deliver it to you guys. And we will be recording the last episode after this class is over. Any of you are invited to stay. So with no further ado, I hand it over to Dr. John Colarusso.
Thank you, Will, and thank you all for being here. So you could have snuck out, I guess, at that point. And I hope that you're not going to be disappointed. By training, I'm a linguist, and that training, well, Harvard was peculiar, unlike MIT and Chomsky and all. We actually had to learn some languages. We actually had to zero in on something. And by chance, I ended up working on probably the world's most complicated languages. These are found in the Caucasus Mountains of what is now Russia, and then to the south, the 3 countries of Abkhazia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. If you want to know where these are, go back to the Sochi Olympics and look at those beautiful mountains and hills in the background there. That's the Caucasus Mountain Range. And in fact, I can tell you what Sochi means. It's from a language called Ubykh, and it meant seaside place, Shvitche in Ubykh. So somehow I ended up doing their tales, and as fate would have it, I ended up becoming a mythologist. I don't watch a lot of movies because I can generally guess what's going to happen. I learned early in my marriage, with a few rebukes from my wife, to keep my mouth shut and stop saying, "Well, you know what's going to happen next, and you know how it's going to end, and don't you remember that other movie, and the myth of so and so and all this." So when you know a fair bit of this stuff, this world of the great movie thing is actually simply a manifestation. It's a modern manifestation of the older material. They didn't have the technology. They had to do it by mouth, word of mouth, and that did affect the form and whatnot. But what's happening in the production of movies is that we're seeing a modern utilization of material ideas, or what we call archetypes, that are millennia old. And I think one of the dreams I have, and perhaps I share it with Dr. Lin, is that in some way, by bringing more myth to you all, to you future movie makers, the movies are going to be even better. Of course, then there'll be the mythologist sitting in front of the TV, and she or he will say, "Oh, of course, you know what's going to happen, right?" But then they eventually learn if they have any brains and keep their mouth shut. So my first capsule or installment of this 10 episode podcast is called Putting on the Mythic Lens. And I'm going to talk about the most valuable lessons that myth can teach you. And the reason that it teaches you is one of the reasons that we still have it, and we still use it, and it's still passed down, and it's been passed down for a long, long time. Now, when I speak of a mythic lens, I mean the sensation one has when you sit down and start reading a myth. And just before I even begin to discuss myth, I want to talk about folklore. Because myth is part of folklore. And what does folklore mean? It means stories told by people. And we divide this, folklorists, and I'm sort of peripheral to that industry, but I've tried to get on top of it and say something intelligent about it because I deal with those people all the time. Folklore is divided into certain domains. There are epics. And these are accounts of people that do great things, and maybe they're a bit exaggerated, but they are about generally an identifiable historical event, usually a war. That's the most common one. Sometimes about killing a monster, that would be Beowulf, that kind of thing. Then there are sagas, and these are even more realistic, and you may have heard of the Norse sagas. And I can get pretty weird, some of them, but generally speaking, they're about family histories and things like this. They're very well known. Then there are fables, and fables are directed at children. And children have a special, you're getting old enough now to sort of leave it behind. They have a special rapport with animals. And it's usually the characters in the fables are animals, and they do things. So that's a special category. Then we have sort of folk tales. Now there's a confusion and a dispute between whether folk tales are myth or not, and I would say no. You read a folk tale, it has a mundane quality, it's about clever Hans, somebody does some smart ass thing, and then they're caught up in it, and they lose face. Or someone who's considered stupid is actually very bright, and so forth and so on. And there are tricks. They're fun. They're not going to ask questions of the sort or present answers of the sort that myth is going to do. And when you get to myth, there's a weirdness. There's a strange feel to the material. And you encounter it very quickly as you get into a reading of a text or something like this, or actually hear someone reciting one. The world, and this nice dichotomy, it's on the other side now, the thing here, this dichotomy of the normal world and the other world and all that, immediately you're thrown into the other world in some way. So that all your bearings, all your orientation, the fixed points by which you guide your life, of whatever stage you're at, these things are suddenly shrouded, and you're floating free. There's a name for it that goes back exactly to this idea of floating. It's called the oceanic feeling. And it's very close to religious experience in some way. I don't know if anyone here has had one. People have them. There was a famous psychologist named William James, and he was hopping on a streetcar. This was back at the beginning of the 20th century. He was at Harvard. He was hopping on a streetcar, and he wasn't a religious person. And all of a sudden, he was overcome with a religious experience, getting on a streetcar. They can come at the weird times. And he wrote a whole article on the varieties of religious experience. He was amazed by it. But when you get into myth books, they're drawing into something very similar. They ask questions about where the universe came from. Folk tales don't do that. Where the universe is going to go. Folk tales don't do that. How it's going to end. They don't do that. Where did humans come from? Folk tales don't do that. And so on and so forth. There's these fundamental questions of origin, of source, and of primal form. So often in myths, they will define the first this, the first that, the first tree, the first human, the first betrayal, first murder, Cain and Abel in the Bible, these sorts of things. So it deals with primordial originals. It gives them names. Norse is one of the best for this. They even name water buckets. And if you go to IKEA, you can still see them doing this. They don't just give a code, get this ashtray or something. It's going to have actually a name, some kind of Norse name. So some of these things carry down, and they're utilized for other stuff, but they come from these original sort of strange tales that are told. I argued in another podcast that ultimately these things pile up in layers like geographic strata, and in fact, every language, every culture will have a very deep, very old layer, and these are the ones that are myth. They're garbled, they're inconsistent, and so on. But, and this is the one I want to talk about in the lens here, they give you answers to questions that are pertinent to life, and have always been pertinent to life, and will always be pertinent to life of this species as long as we survive. So they answer questions like who we are. More specifically, in this particular one, I'm going to have another one where I talk about the we part, but who you are. And when you're young, and sometimes, and this, a lot of what I'm going to say here applies to people your age. When you're young, you face a series of problems. You're no longer just a kid. You're no longer the one in grade school or high school. You have to find a new identity in some way. You have to fit in. You have to have a profession. You dress a certain way, and so on. You wear your hat this way or that way. These things, somehow gradually accrue to you. And you're developing identities, and myth will offer you models for those identities. The thing about the models is that they are exaggerated. They are designed not to pin you down to a precise orientation, a precise set of coordinates, but to give you a kind of floating idea, a template, a paradigm, we could say in philosophy or math, an example of what you can be and how you can do this. Okay. And of course, no one comes out of nothing. Well, there was Dolly the sheep. I don't know, let's not go there. You all have families. You all have backgrounds. And it tells you about how to view your background, how to deal with your parents. And there are a lot of stories of this character. Some of those leak over into folk tales as such, but in myth they have a kind of profound, often tragic dimension to their component. And in that regard, they tell you what is good and evil. And they label things as good and label them as evil, and those concepts emerge in that. And you may think, well, that's religion. And one of the great sayings of Mark Twain was, myth is someone else's religion in which you do not believe. All right? But if you go back and study ancient religions, good and evil did not emerge until the Zoroastrians came up with it about 3,000 years ago. So you got another 2,000 years before that of recorded history, and all they're talking about how you screw your enemies. Oh, God, screw my enemies, Oh, cattle God, bring plague upon my neighbor because he's got too many more cattle than I have, and that kind of thing. Very, very moral neutral. So maybe this is a new idea. Maybe this myth brings it in. But I find good and evil even before that, before it's encoded in religion. So the balance between religion and myth is a bit tricky. Mark Twain was not quite right. He was being humorous. It was a good one. Okay. Now, when there's good and evil, it tells you who's going to be the good one, who's going to be the evil one. And of course, it generally tells the reader to be a good person. Why? Because that's part of you don't want to be evil. And I think back to Breaking Bad. And at one point, I can't remember his name, the high school teacher was what? Walter White, yeah, and the young guy was, Yes, and at one point, he's trying to figure out who he is. His parents reject him. He's trying to get his life all together and whatnot. And he says to Mr. White, Mr. White, I know who I am. I'm one of the bad guys. And I thought, that's a beautiful mythic line. And it's an aberration. It's unusual. There's something weird about that. Most myths will have you become the good woman, the good man. But by the writer is very clever. By making him the bad guy, it actually tells you about becoming the good person. See, he's a fallen angel, so to speak. Okay, and Satan is a fallen figure. He was an angel. He was thrown out by God to do evil. Someone had to do the job. I've read it in Persian, okay? And he said, God, why do I have to do this? I'm an angel too. He said, someone's got to do it, and I chose you. And I'm the boss. Down you go. Okay. But that defines God. That defines the good. And the Persian stuff, of course, is a derivative ultimately, although it's couched in Muslim terms, is a derivative of Zoroastrianism. So sometimes when things fail and are broken, it tells you more about what is success and working than just laying out the good parts. So good and evil is a very interesting opposition, and it pertains precisely to the nature of your own conduct in your own life, and it is a way of helping you to define and judge and pursue your goals. Now, you may do things that someone else thinks are horrible. I'm sure Donald Trump thinks he's just fine, and everyone else, we're all sort of worried about this guy. Right? But I don't want to, take political sides up in front. This is not a politics talk. So these things are idiosyncratically pinned to your identity. They're not absolute. And it's a lens. It's your way of looking at yourself and looking at your world, and somebody else is going to have their mythic lens, and they're going to look at you differently, look at themselves differently from the way you see them, and look at their world differently as well. So we get this heterogeneity. I was a security advisor for the Clinton administration because I'm an expert on the Caucasus, and they had wars there 20 years ago. I spent 9 years flying back and forth to Washington, Moscow, and whatnot, and the other. And I very quickly came to realize when I was sitting across on the negotiating table with someone who was a warlord who was responsible for the death of tens of thousands of people, this is a horrible situation, that they believed what they believed in as firmly as I believed they were evil. They were there for a different reason. They had a different history and different goals and different needs. And they were sincere about their position as I was about mine. And that makes a very difficult confrontation, very, very difficult exchange. You have to look very hard, work very hard to find some way of making that session do something. All right, we're going to stop killing for 24 hours, like in Aleppo, something like that. These little things, these little increments sometimes come out, sometimes they're measured as a success, even if they don't really solve a problem. They begin to put the brakes on. It's like a freight train. You put the brakes on, it's going to take a few miles to stop, and this is what often these wars are like. Wars are very hard to stop once they're started. And I think Putin's finding that out. Okay. Now, tangibly, literally, as an example I just gave you, myths will define who our friends are and who our enemies are. They reach out beyond the individual because the individual is set in a social and often a civic context of some sort, sometimes a tribe, sometimes some other kind of thing. Like we have a lot of First Nation, American Indians up in Canada. Just down the road, we teach Mohawk at my university. And you can belong to a tribe, you can belong to a clan, you can belong to an ethnic group, or you can belong to a nation state, as we would say technically. And curiously, that good and evil business extends to that. We're already building on that. And extends to that. So technically, your society is good, theirs is bad. Now, we have a very interesting phenomenon going on. Since I was your age and maybe a bit before, there was a tradition going back, say, into the 20s and 30s when things went haywire, the Great Depression, and the First World War, Second World War, and so on, where we have internal criticism. This is actually something relatively new. You can read about, say, Genghis Khan. We know quite a bit about him. And Mongol onslaught, just as an example. There was no one, in the ranks of the Mongols saying, Genghis, maybe we shouldn't cut off all these heads. That's not nice. Okay? No, that didn't happen. Let's go cut off more heads. I mean, Genghis says cut off more heads. Off we go. We'll attack the next city and we'll cut off more heads. So what we're doing is something new. And as old and built in sort of in many regards as the archetypes are and the mythology that utilizes may be, it doesn't preclude new things from coming along, new things from happening. And that's always possible as well. It's important to keep that in mind. Okay. Now, if you're going to join society as a whole, one of the ways of doing it, this fellow in the back, he mentioned heterosexual standard or norm, and so on. It's a good point. Because the traditional mythic designation for what you're going to do to fit into that society is that you're going to follow a heterosexual path. Okay. And that means that you have to be told in some way what love is or how you're going to find that mate, that spouse, and then you have to decide whether that's an appropriate match or not. And of course, the great tragedies, the great tearjerkers are when people fall in love. What is love? There are whole societies in which there's no concept of romantic love. Whole mythologies, you look for it in vain, you're not going to find it. Lust, yes. Okay. Well, hereditary matching, yes. Okay. But romantic love, well, Irish is one. There's always troubles. Okay. It's hard, believe me. Well, we won't go into my personal details, but just take it from me. Sometimes being in love and staying in love, and not falling in love with somebody else, this can be really a challenge. And no one talks about these things too much, but the myths do. Mommy and Daddy may sit you down and talk about the birds and the bees, but they're not going to tell you, well, you're going to go out and marry so-and-so in that clan. But there are societies where that happens, and they're not here. So this is one particular tradition in which love is supposed to be at work. So, and you get myths that tell you what love is. It gives you examples of people falling in love. Okay, and they talk about love sickness, things like that. People who do not return the love of the lover. And then they talk about perhaps how you act, husband to wife, wife to husband, treat each other with respect. It's not a bad idea. We let it all hang out. There's this sort of, nothing I couldn't tell you. Well, that's not a good idea. I mean, sometimes there are things you shouldn't tell your wife, things you shouldn't tell your husband. Why? Because it hurts them. It worries them. It makes them doubt themselves or whatever. You have to be kind. You have to be considerate. And you have to be polite. And that's sort of against the modern idea of freedom and romantic love and openness and all that. And myths will tell you these things. They lay down the borders, in certain cases, for the relationship, how it's to work, what you're to do and not to do. So that's bringing you along. Now, what happens? What are we doing if we're doing heterosexual path? And there's almost no homosexual paths in myth. I know of one, and it's a trick. It's fake. Okay, and it's weird because obviously we have whole society in ancient Greece where homosexuality was almost the norm in some way. So why don't we see it in the myth? Well, my guess is that myth is drawing upon blocks, archetypes, building blocks that somehow have evolved along with language, along with the species, along with cognition. Myths were tales of entertainment that's helped the bands while away the hours after they'd eaten the antelope and were sitting around the fire worrying about whether the wolves are going to come next. Okay, and I think that this was a limited regime, so to speak, a limited era in which reproduction was really crucial. Now, we reproduce, we have kids. You know they're a pain in the ass. Did your parents ever tell you that? You're a pain in the ass. No, they never do that. It's a mixed bag. You know, did you? Oh, they shouldn't have done that. The myths will say, not do that to your kids. No, they're difficult. Children are difficult. Ever change a diaper? Oh, my God. I've lost my sense of smell. I blame it on changing too many diapers. My children were little. I have 3. Now, the weird thing is there's almost nothing about children in myth. Why? Because once you do it, biology takes over. It's just you have to cope however best. If the kid sleeps, you're lucky. If the kid's up, you got to go with it. You're young, you can get out there and boogie till 3 in the morning. You know what? Mother Nature wanted you to be walking the baby with that energy. And when you start having the baby and you're 30, 35, oh my God, what am I doing? You can hardly stand up sometimes at 4 in the morning. There's a kind of biological regime that was old that really governed our ancestors, and myth does reflect some of that. And there's a minimal amount about children. You have them, you deal with it. But there are things like the changeling. Well, the baby won't sleep, so put it in the fire. If it burns up, oh, well, it's a real baby. If it doesn't burn up, it's a changeling. We'll kill it anyway. Something I don't. Sometimes it goes the other way. And I can imagine these horrible stories. Put the kid in the fire. Oh my God! This is a changeling story because the kid was colicky. All the medicine. They still don't know what causes it. Some kids just have pain when they eat, and they do it for maybe 4 or 5 months, 6 months. And actually, I'm only 35 years old, and all this white is from my first child who wouldn't sleep longer than 20 minutes for the first 6 months of his life. Who was colicky. No, I'm teasing you. You can guess how old I am. Okay, so that's a peculiar feature about myth, not telling you much. It gives you the changeling story. So maybe it's an out in case you just couldn't stand what's going on. But once you're in the family unit and whatnot, supposedly you're in a tribe or you're in an extended unit, and that's got to have a leader. And it tells you generally how someone becomes a leader or what makes them or him, or usually him, but there are ones, he, usually there are a few that are she's. The Mohawks are actually ruled by women. I've seen it at meetings. Okay. So how they got there, why they're there, what they're supposed to do for you. And generally speaking, they harbor all the wealth. I know the 1% came up. There's in the front row here. 1%. They harbor all the wealth and they distribute it. Go to Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole and Anthony Quinn, and Peter confronts Anthony, who's playing the role of Abu Tayi, a famous, in Arabian circles, a famous a chieftain of a clan. And he says, I am a river to my people. And they all applaud and they make the ululating noise, which is like applause. And what they did was they took all the wealth. They harbored it all, but they distributed it so that no one was left out. No one was going to go hungry. No one was going to go naked. No one was going to feel that they really should not be part of the group, that they were not being treated right. But that meant that you allowed them to do it. Now we got 1%. We have the greatest imbalance of wealth in modern history in the last 300, 400 years. These things don't end well. I think Bernie Sanders was trying to give the rich a way out before we go to the lamppost and start stringing people up. And oh my God, who knows? I'm getting into politics. I don't want to do that. But you see, in a way, this configuration is somehow old. Now it's new now, but this thing seems to happen again and again. Play Monopoly. Eventually someone comes out with everything. That's how it works. And you fold the game up and go away and you play poker and try to get it back or something. So, in a sense, the 1% is a mythic configuration. It's almost an inevitability. It doesn't tell you what to do with it. What it does say to the chief, if the chief is depicted in the myth, you must be good, you must be fair. And at least people like Warren Buffett, they make gestures. Bill Gates, they start foundations and whatnot. That's a modern reflection of this imperative from the myths. Of course, the chief is, or chief, let's call him a chief. Let's call her a chieftain. Chieftainess, chieftainess. Okay, happy? Chiefess doesn't work. We'll just say the head of the clan. You're going to take the clan somewhere. We're talking about how you get to where you're going to be, where you came from, but most myths also tell you where you're going to go. Because the future is sort of a blank, and it can be very worrisome at times. So it gives you assurance where you're going to go. It gives hope to the hopeless, I was going to say wealth to the poor, and it gives strength to the weak. And some of that can only be promised if the future delivers that. So it tells you, gives you a place to seek, a place to go into the future, into time. And time unfolds. And one day you'll be all white and tired out the way I am here. And it'll be like, gee, what happened? This is what my old high school friends say. What happened? Well, time passed. And supposedly in some way, that future should match up to some extent with the past, and it should be meaningful. Now, what do I mean by meaningful? Well, I know it when I feel it. Actually, in linguistics, the most difficult topic, I have taught it a few times, is meaning. It's very difficult to pin down, but we have some ideas about it. So if I have, let's say here, I have something like this. In one of the languages I worked on, during the Soviet period, it was stakan. That was a glass. This is not stakan. But a stakan, which is Russian for glass. The Soviet Union fell, and the next thing I know, they've invented a word for it. Pshishwit. That's crazy language. Pshishwit. And I was even there when I said, what's the rim of the glass? Oh, and there was a debate among these 4 or 5 guys. Oh, that's a pshishwit. Pshishwit. Means your lips, edge of the door. It was the edge. It's a word for edge. Okay. I saw them invent a word, but it's just a glass. It's an object. And semantics of language is designed to work and give you those meanings, allow you to name things. Now, there are bigger things that you have to worry about than objects. Worry about the course of your life, worry about what the clan is doing, what the tribe is doing, what your nation is doing, who your leader is, what the future is, what the threats are, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and so forth. And these are big, large-scale phenomena, and you're aware of them. And you would like them to mean something. But the machinery you use for making meaning for words is not going to work at that level. And what happens is a myth steps into that, and politics steps into that. So I have my friends say, well, how'd you end up being an advisor for, all this? And because you do myth, and how did you? Well, the transition from myth into politics is seamless, because both do the same thing, basically. In very much similar terms, they provide meaning for large-scale phenomena that you can perceive, and sometimes help you perceive them even better than you would. You can sort of sense that something is wrong, and a good politician, a good myth will come along and allow you to make sense of that and give it meaning. It may be bad, it may be horrifying, it may be threatening, but it gives you meaning in some way. Okay. Then, since we're in the world and we're talking about the future of the world and the past of the world and whatnot and the other, and we play out our lives in the world, often myth will tell you, in fact, where the entire world comes from, the origin of the world, how it's all laid out. And one of the best examples is Norse. Okay, where there's this great void, and down here is a kind of a world of ice and fog, and over here is a world of fire and heat, and they come together in the middle, and that's called the yawning gap. And yawning, trust me, I'm a linguist, yawning is the same word as ginunga. And it's ginunga in Norse, the yawning in English. The G becomes a Y and whatnot. It is the same word as chaos in Greek, which is chaos originally. These are derived from our parent language. It goes back about 5,000 years. And that's also something that historical linguistics, something that is a kind of time machine that takes us there. So it gives us the origin of the cosmos, the significance, the structure of the cosmos, the significance of it, and where it's going to go. And there will be an end. And in Norse, we got a beautiful end. We got Ragnarok, and all the gods fight together, and everyone dies, and the world sinks and crumbles into things. And it's very dramatic. And my colleagues are all looking around for something like that in other mythologies, and they find a few, right? What they miss is that a new world is resurrected, brought up, much better world from the ruins of the old. And you never hear about that. Okay. Tolkien did that, it's a Gimli and all this kind of thing. It's the name of a dwarf in Tolkien, but it was the name of the new world. Okay. And then, of course, the new world needs staff to run it. And one doesn't relinquish the older patterns. They're reinstated, but they're reinstated perfectly and so forth and the other. But let's go back to the end of the world. Now, I grew up during the Cold War, conducted most of my life during the Cold War, and I was very much worried about the nuclear holocaust and whatnot. And my father was in the American military. I'm in Canada. I'm a dual citizen. And he would drag me along to the Parent-Teachers Association meetings at the grade school. Here I was 8 years old, 9 years old. And what did he put up on he put up movies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And my God, like that. Right? Horrifying, horrifying. And it burned itself into my mind. And later, when I was on a blog or a set of advisors for the Clinton people, there was talk of using a nuke. I don't want to go tell you where. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And I said to them, gang, I said, that weapon brings with it political fallout that's much worse even than the destruction. And I couldn't get them to understand it because they were all younger than me by maybe 20 years. I had to dig up film footage of a bomb going off and post it on the blog line. And then they all backed off and they said, oh my God, is this what we're talking about? I said, yes, you don't want to do this. And when I was dealing with Clinton, at one point I was dealing with Moscow, I would get phone calls. Do you think this is going to fly in Washington? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. And Washington would say, okay, do you think this is going to fly in Moscow? Yes, maybe no. That's what a back channel does. And one time I picked up the phone, do you think if we dropped an atom bomb on the Chechen capital that it would be okay? You don't get phone calls like that. No, it's a tough one to answer. I said, no, it's not good. It's not okay. So what we have technology that's outstripped the conventional ideas of how you deal with your enemies. And what we have to do is come up with some mechanism for saying you've crossed a line. We have no way of making sense out of these new capacities and can't. There's no way of dealing, say, with an atom bomb. 10,000 times brighter than the surface of the sun. Okay? I was in physics originally, so I know all that. I know how to make one. It's that category of the new. And you don't have material at hand, you simply have to show a scene and give shock. Look, you want to see how bad it is? I'll show you. Blam. You want to see how bad a car wreck is? Let's go watch a car wreck, or something like that. Very hard to describe. And then the sheer raw horror overwhelms any kind of limitations of logic, any kind of limitations of archetypes, or mythologically defined significance, mythologically defined world. So you're at a stage in human history where we're coming up with things that cannot be handled by traditional means, and that means that you're going to have to be creative and come up with new ideas, and maybe film is a very important medium for doing this. And one of the most important things to do or to realize about myth is it does all this educating. It's very important for the development of individuals. Einstein was always asked, I want my baby to be like you, which, it's problematic, but Einstein said, if you want your child to grow up to be a genius, read them fairy tales, read them folklore. I think he said Märchen in German, Märchen, which is sort of fairy tales. But I would say more read myths, because it enhances the very nature by which your brain works. It's a foundational intelligence upon which the newer stuff is built. And there's always going to be good and evil, questions of identity. And what we now have situations where we have people trying to genocide other people. Nazis tried to genocide the Jews, the Turks, the Armenians. And believe me, there were sentiments like this running afoot in the Balkans and the Caucasus when there were wars as well. This is not really in myth either. I've yet to see a genocide archetype in myth. I don't know, Dr. Lin, maybe you will. You maybe have something on hand. It's vast, and you can't master it all. It's inherently a collaborative effort. But I haven't seen one. And I would say that one of the great shocks, one of the great difficulties, the reason people keep trying to annihilate the other tribe, first of all, they don't see them as people. They see them as different from their own group. They don't have a concept of individual plasticity and whatnot. They're like a potted plant. You can't deal with them. You might as well exterminate them. It's the only way to handle them. And there's nothing in the repertoire of good and evil and how they see their society that puts a brake on that. That's part of the freight train without brakes. So again, it's a very difficult thing. It's a modern phenomenon. I won't call it technology, but it is something that is easier now with technology. And it's something that we've yet to come up with an effective argument to say, no, you can't do this. We cannot go to a group and instill in them or call upon some kind of myth, archetype, whatever in their background that will make them think, oh, well, I shouldn't do this. You can't elicit it. You have to either threaten them or restrain them or whatever. We've yet to work out effective means. And the problem is it keeps popping up again and again because you can't go back and actually reach in and say, look, here's the myth of so-and-so. Remember that one? And there was silence. They were all dead. There was nothing left, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And the only place we get is like the end of the world. And for the people who are the target of genocide, it's like the end of the world. Okay. And I've talked with some of these people. It's a damaging position to be in. It leaves you scarred. It leaves you angry. It leaves you determined never to suffer again. And you see this, say, with the conduct of the Israelis and their policy. Never again. It's never going to happen. Oh, we're going to blow up a few Palestinians. We don't care. It's never going to happen again because always it's played against that backdrop. The Russians are somewhat like that too. They have this huge open territory they control. It allowed them to expand, but it also meant they were chronically open to assault. And so the Russians are obsessed. The Klingons are patterned after the Russians. They're obsessed with security. We became friends, the guy and I. He said, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. What we want to know is what damage you can do. And we want to make sure you cannot do that. Because now you're friends. Maybe next time you're going to be enemies. And they are afraid of annihilation. It's a huge nation. It's a powerful nation. It sounds nuts to speak of them that way. But that's at the heart and core of Russian identity. They were assaulted by the Mongols. I got drunk with them one night. And we were walking around talking. He starts blubbering, crying, literally. He's a big, tall guy. And he said, you didn't come to our aid. We were being annihilated. We were being destroyed. You didn't come to our aid. You didn't care. I thought for a minute, and I said, well, we sent all these cargo ships to Murmansk, avoiding the U-boats, and great risk to our sailors to try to get you food and supplies. But I mean Genghis Khan. 850 years later, he was still crying over this great tragedy. That's how deep those scars run. Okay. And myth is not there. We don't have anything to assuage that. So I want to talk about the function, the vitality of myth, the importance of myth, but I think it's very important to understand its limitations and how it's up to you in the future if you're going to try to have your art make an impact on the society at large and therefore on the leaders, that you'd be willing and able to think very hard about some of these things and perhaps come up with some new ways of solving some problems that are almost impossible from our perspective now to solve or even deal with in any kind of meaningful way. Well, thank you. I hope that it was an entertaining or useful talk. And I guess we open it now to questions.
Thanks, John.
I talked too fast.